To the world, Marilyn Monroe was luminous, an untouchable icon of beauty and charm. But just before he passed, the man responsible for perfecting her image finally told the truth. Her longtime makeup artist, silent for decades, confessed what he kept hidden: that Marilyn often arrived on set with bruises, and that it was his job to make sure no one ever saw them. He didn't ask questions. He just covered the evidence. And what he revealed before his death changes how many fans now remember her. Because the truth he concealed wasn't just about makeup. It was about pain. Before the lights hit her face, before the cameras began rolling, before the world saw her as Marilyn Monroe, the dream made flesh, there was one man she always turned to first. Alan "Whitey" Snyder wasn't just a makeup artist. He was Marilyn's closest collaborator in constructing the myth the world came to worship. From the earliest days of her career at 20th Century Fox, Whitey was there, quietly brushing, blending, and softening reality. He knew her skin better than anyone, not just the texture of it, but the secrets it held. And unlike the studio heads, agents, or directors who saw Marilyn as a product, Whitey saw the woman beneath the facade. He saw the girl who winced when he applied foundation too firmly, the one who sometimes avoided mirrors entirely, the one who leaned in a little too close and whispered, "Can you make me look less tired today?" Their working relationship began in the late 1940s, when Marilyn was still Norma Jean trying to find her way into the Hollywood system. Whitey had a reputation for being meticulous, but also kind, a rarity in an industry obsessed with perfection. For Marilyn, who had already learned how conditional affection could be, that kindness meant everything. As her star rose, so did the expectations. The public wanted perfection. Marilyn's every appearance had to shimmer with effortless glamour. But behind the scenes, that kind of shine took hours. And as the years went on, it took more than powder and lipstick to achieve. It took concealment, not just of blemishes, but of signs no one was supposed to see. Whitey never spoke publicly about the details while Marilyn was alive. But those closest to him always said he carried something heavy, something he kept to himself out of loyalty. He never betrayed her trust, even as she became more fragile, even as the demands on her intensified, even when the bruises appeared. He didn't name names. He didn't speculate. That wasn't who he was. His job was simple: make her look untouched. Make her look like the fantasy the world needed her to be. And Marilyn trusted him completely, so much so that when she began to fear the worst, that her fame would end, that the studio would discard her, that no one would ever really know her, she still knew one thing for sure: Whitey would never hurt her. In fact, she trusted him so deeply that she made an unthinkable request, one she would eventually put into her will. She asked him to do her makeup one last time after she died, so the world would remember her the way he'd always made her look: perfect, serene, unbroken. At the time, it sounded like something said in jest. But when the day came in 1962, he honored that promise, even though it shattered him. And it wasn't until decades later, near the end of his own life, that Whitey finally admitted what he'd been hiding all those years. Not just the physical evidence, but the emotional cost of helping Marilyn carry a truth she was too afraid to share herself. The world saw the transformation, from vulnerable starlet to glowing goddess. But only Whitey saw what it took. Only he knew what was beneath the makeup. And by the time he finally told the truth, it wasn't for fame. It wasn't for profit. It was because the silence had become too heavy to carry. Because even in death, Marilyn still deserved someone to speak on her behalf. And what he said next, about the bruises, the fear, the quiet suffering, would leave fans reeling. Marilyn Monroe was always expected to sparkle. She was the fantasy, the American dream in a white dress. And while the world focused on the curves, the smile, the platinum hair, Whitey Snyder was seeing something else, something far more real. He never spoke about it at the time, but in the years leading up to his death, those close to him say the weight of what he'd witnessed had become impossible to ignore. Quietly, carefully, he began to reveal pieces of the truth, not in press conferences or headlines, but in private moments, with people who would listen. One of those truths was this: Marilyn often came to the studio with marks. Not dramatic ones, not the kind that would send a production into panic, but subtle, purplish hints just beneath the skin. Bruises on her arms, a shadow across her jaw. Once, a deep discoloration on her shoulder blade that made Whitey pause longer than usual. He never asked where they came from. He never needed to. In that era, women didn't speak up, especially not in Hollywood, especially not someone like Marilyn, who had everything to lose. Her entire image was built on being wanted, admired, adored. And if the world even suspected that someone had laid a hand on her, or that she was falling apart behind the scenes, it would have shattered everything. So Whitey did what he was trained to do. He covered them. He mixed foundation with peach and yellow tones to cancel out the purples and greens. He used lighting tricks and camera angles to soften anything makeup couldn't. And when Marilyn asked him, "Can they tell?" he always said no, even when he wasn't sure. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Costumers occasionally whispered about red marks near her ribs. A few hairdressers claimed they saw her flinch when touched near her temples. But it was Whitey who had to face it head-on, up close, every day. And over time, he stopped pretending the bruises weren't there. He just stopped acknowledging them. Because what could he do? He wasn't her husband. He wasn't her manager. He was the man who made her beautiful, and sometimes that meant helping her hide the pain. What haunted him most wasn't the covering up. It was that he could tell. She didn't want him to ask. She needed him to make it go away, not just from her skin, but from her memory. That perhaps is why he stayed silent for so long. He didn't want to betray her. He didn't want to reduce her legacy to a list of suspicions. Marilyn had fought so hard to be taken seriously, as more than a body, more than a symbol. And Whitey knew that if he spoke too soon, her story would be twisted. But with time came reflection. And near the end of his life, he confided in a close friend that it wasn't just makeup he was applying. It was armor. And every time he painted over those bruises, he felt complicit. Like he was helping the world pretend she wasn't hurting. He said quietly that he wished someone had seen through it. That someone, anyone, had said, "What's going on with Marilyn?" But no one did, because she looked flawless, because he'd done his job too well. And when he finally opened up about the truth, there was no anger in his voice, only regret, not for what he did, but for what he couldn't do. He could hide the bruises. He could make her look radiant, but he couldn't save her. What he shared would lead to new questions about the people in Marilyn's life, about what was really happening behind those closed studio doors, and about why no one stopped to ask why a star that bright kept dimming in private. By the time Marilyn Monroe became a global icon, she had perfected the art of pretending everything was fine. She walked red carpets with grace, posed for photographers with practiced ease, and gave interviews with that famous breathy voice. Every inch the Hollywood goddess. But Whitey Snyder saw it unravel. Slowly, then all at once. In private, Marilyn's anxiety often spiraled. Her insomnia was chronic. Her dependence on sleeping pills and stimulants became more visible to those closest to her. And behind closed doors, the emotional pressure of remaining America's most desired woman, while also navigating a string of toxic relationships, took its toll. Whitey wasn't a therapist. He wasn't a doctor. But he was there. Every morning, every set, every press junket. He saw the way her hands trembled when a call ran late. He noticed when she started arriving in sunglasses, even in the makeup chair. He noticed when the bruises became more frequent and harder to hide. She rarely explained them. If he lingered too long while covering a mark, she'd simply say, "Just make me look okay." That was all. Not pretty, not glamorous, just okay. And Whitey, ever professional, did what he always did. He nodded and got to work. But inside, something shifted. He began to realize he wasn't just applying cosmetics. He was erasing evidence. And the price of doing that over and over was beginning to show on him too. People often forget that those behind the scenes carry a burden of their own. Whitey didn't have the power to protect Marilyn. He had access to her, but not control. And so he made himself useful in the only way he could. making sure the bruises, the blotchiness, the weariness never showed. But it gnawed at him, because the more he hid, the more isolated she became. Marilyn couldn't cry out, not without risking her career, her contracts, her status. And so she learned to lean on people who wouldn't ask questions, who would just fix it. For Marilyn, that meant relying on Whitey. And for Whitey, it meant holding secrets he never wanted to keep. Years later, friends would say that Whitey became withdrawn when talking about the height of Marilyn's fame. He'd smile when remembering the early days, the innocence of her first screen test, her goofy jokes, the way she lit up when a scene went well. But when pressed about her final years, he changed. His words slowed. His eyes dropped. He'd say things like, "She was tired," or "She wasn't sleeping." Never the full story, just enough to show it haunted him. The weight of that silence, of knowing but never intervening, was a guilt he carried long after she was gone. Not because he felt responsible for her pain, but because he'd helped cover it. Out of loyalty, out of fear, out of love. There's a heartbreaking irony in the fact that the man who made Marilyn Monroe shine the brightest was also the one who saw how dim she felt inside. And while the world applauded his work, he quietly wished he could have done more than just mask the damage. When he finally spoke about the bruises, just once, to someone close, he didn't blame anyone by name. He didn't even say how many times it happened. But his voice, they said, cracked. Because by then, it wasn't about makeup anymore. It was about the price of silence. And that silence, once broken, would change how people looked at Marilyn forever. In the end, it wasn't the glamour or the fame that stayed with Whitey Snyder. It was the promise. Years before her death, when Marilyn was still clinging to the fragments of her career, she'd made an unusual request. Came out during a quiet moment, just the two of them after a long shoot when the cameras had stopped rolling and the world wasn't watching. She turned to Whitey and said, "If anything ever happens to me, I want you to do my makeup. One last time." To anyone else, it might have sounded morbid, but to Whitey it was sacred. A sign that despite all the fame, the chaos, and the betrayals, Marilyn trusted him more than anyone else to preserve her final image. Not for the tabloids, not for the studios, but for dignity. He agreed without hesitation. He didn't think she'd go first. But on August 5th, 1962, she did, and the world stopped. Marilyn Monroe was gone at just 36 years old. The official story was barbiturate overdose. But the questions came immediately. The conspiracy theories, the cover-up accusations, the whispers of foul play. Everyone wanted to know how she died. But for Whitey, none of that mattered in the moment, because all he could think about was that promise. He showed up, quiet, professional, grief-stricken, and he did what he had always done. He made her beautiful. Not the Hollywood kind of beauty, but a peaceful kind, farewell kind. It wasn't about hiding bruises anymore. It was about giving her the rest she never got in life. He used the same techniques he always had. The soft creams, the rose tones she liked, the eyelashes she'd insisted on even in her most exhausted states. And when he finished, he didn't weep. He didn't speak. He just sat beside her, the silence between them heavier than any words could hold. There were no camera flashes that day, no magazine spreads, just Whitey, honoring the only real friendship Marilyn had left untouched by fame. And for years, he refused to talk about it. Not out of shame, but because it felt like a private goodbye. It was only decades later, with the weight of age and reflection, that he finally opened up about what that final moment meant to him, and how much he had been holding back, about the bruises, the fear, and the feeling of helplessness that haunted him long after Marilyn was gone. The truth was, Marilyn hadn't asked him for perfection in the end. She'd asked him for peace, and he gave it to her the only way he knew how. He told a friend that day broke him, that after years of helping her hide the signs of pain, he was finally forced to look at what couldn't be covered up. The loss, the loneliness, the cost of pretending to be okay for too long. And when he finally spoke about it years later, his voice was flat, but his eyes were not. They said more than words could. That somewhere deep inside, he believed if he had looked a little harder, if he had asked the right question, Maybe someone could have saved her. He never blamed himself. But he never forgave himself either. Because Whitey wasn't just the man who gave Marilyn Monroe her iconic glow. He was the one person who knew what it took to create it, and what it cost her to wear it every day. And in the quiet of that final goodbye, he realized something devastating. He'd made her beautiful so the world would never know she was broken. But now, the world finally knows. By the time Whitey Snyder was nearing the end of his own life, decades had passed since Marilyn Monroe's final curtain. The world had moved on. New stars had risen. But for those who remembered her, truly remembered her, there was always one lingering question. What really happened to Marilyn? Whitey had been asked countless times. By journalists, by biographers, by fans hoping for a hint of something new. He declined every time. He didn't want to be another person exploiting her memory. He had protected her then, and he believed he still needed to protect her now. But something shifted in him as he aged. It wasn't a desire to capitalize. It wasn't for attention. It was regret. Not because he kept secrets, but because he kept them for so long. And so, privately, to a friend he trusted, he finally opened up. It wasn't a tell-all. There were no headlines. Just a quiet conversation. A man reflecting on a lifetime of loyalty and pain. He spoke about the bruises first. How Marilyn would show up with marks that made him pause, but never speak. He described how carefully he had to mix concealers, how lighting was adjusted at the last second, how sometimes it took hours just to make her look normal. He talked about how Marilyn would flinch if someone entered the room too loudly, how she always kept one arm wrapped around herself, like she was holding herself together, how she stopped looking in the mirror after a certain point, because she didn't want to see what he saw. And then, he shared something no one had expected. One day, near the end of her life, Marilyn had arrived on set with a bruise near her temple. Larger than usual, harder to cover. He hesitated. For a split second, he almost said something. But then she looked at him with tired eyes and simply whispered, "Please, just make me look okay." He never forgot it. That was the moment he realized the makeup wasn't hiding a one-time incident. It was hiding a pattern, a history, a quiet suffering she was too afraid to name, and he had become part of it. He said that moment haunted him for the rest of his life, because in trying to protect her image, he had helped protect the people, and the culture that allowed her pain to continue. The studios that overworked her, the men who used her, the silence that consumed her. When his friend asked why he was finally telling this now, Whitey's answer was simple. Because she deserved better than that. He didn't name the men. He didn't speculate about what happened behind closed doors. But he made one thing clear: Marilyn was never just fragile. She was strong. Strong enough to survive the abuse. Strong enough to smile through it. Strong enough to keep showing up, even when every part of her body was telling her not to. And yet, no one helped her. His voice cracked when he said it. Because Whitey had seen the bruises. He had heard the silence. And in his own way, he had contributed to it. That conversation never made it into the magazines. It wasn't filmed or recorded, but it passed on, like a whispered truth finally surfacing after years buried beneath foundation and powder. And now, fans are hearing it for the first time. Not to tarnish Marilyn's legacy, but to honor it. To remember that behind the glitter and fame was a woman who fought silently, who asked for so little, who gave so much, and who needed one person, just one, to ask, "Are you okay?" Whitey Snyder never did, but he never stopped wishing he had. Marilyn Monroe will always be remembered for her beauty, her allure, and the legend she became. But behind that flawless face was a woman who carried wounds no one ever saw, because one man made sure they stayed hidden. Whitey Snyder didn't share his truth for headlines or legacy. He shared it because the silence had lasted too long, because the world had fallen in love with an image, never knowing what it cost her to maintain it. And maybe now, in hearing the truth he held onto for decades, we're finally seeing Marilyn not as the myth, but as the woman. The one who smiled when she was hurting. The one who whispered instead of cried out. The one who asked for nothing but to look okay, even when she was anything but. Whitey kept her secret to protect her. But in the end, it was telling that secret that finally gave her the dignity she was denied in life. For more emotional stories, check out this video.